and this other one on open source. So thank you so much to our sponsors, Klaus. I'm going to hand it over to Diana and Jolene. If you have any questions aligned to Women Who Code, go ahead and put those into the chat and I'll answer them there. And for questions on our presentation, you can go ahead and put them into Q&A. And Jolene and Diana will get to them over time. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and handing it over to you both. Very excited for this chat, so thank you.
Thank you. Let me just get my screen sharing up.
Yeah.
All right, so yes, we are part of Clause. We've been partnering with Women Who Code for the second half of this year. And today, yeah, we're gonna be talking about open source contribution, kind of specifically aiming towards Hacktoberfest, which is why I look like a pumpkin today. We're gonna be talking about the open source project that we are participating in called the Quark Project. So the agenda today is going to be a little bit of introductions of us and Clause and a little bit of a Quark project. We're going to recap a video that we made that was published, I think, last week around the what and why of open source. We're going to pause for any questions. So there's going to be a lot of built-in pauses for questions in case there come any on the points that we're specifically talking about. We're going to discuss how to find a project and then pause for questions, how to contribute to a project, pause for questions, speak a bit about Hacktoberfest specifically, and then talk a little bit more about a core project and a specific working group, technology working group call that is coming up this Wednesday. We have these every week, and we'll talk about that specifically. And then questions. So, as we were introduced, my name is Jolene Langlinais. I am a full stack engineer at Clause. That's my Twitter handle. This is Diana.
Yep, I'm a lead front-end engineer at Clause. Please follow me on Twitter and engage and connect.
Yeah, and we're both coming from non-traditional backgrounds, so I think that will flavor a little bit of our presentation here of how to approach open source when you haven't been embedded in software and technology your entire adult life. And that is definitely influenced how I approach with the way that I influence a core project through my maintenance.
Yeah, and I would mention, as said earlier, this webinar was kind of aligned with the Women Who Code front-end track, but obviously open source is for everyone, you know, not just front-end, and this talk won't be, you know, front-end specific. So please stay, even if you're not focused on front-end, you'll definitely get a lot out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this fits in almost any of the tracks specifically. So yeah, so recapping the video that we went over, we won't spend too much time on this because you can find this on Women Who Code's YouTube and Facebook and Twitter. But basically what open source is basically any kind of software technology that is open to the public. So open to the public for use and also contribution. So any software that's owned by a company that is only able to be worked on by those employees or used by those employees, whichever, is proprietary. So open source is kind of the reverse of that. It's open to the public for any use or capacity, and is usually very transparent and has pretty good established governance over how to contribute and be a part of that community. The why you should care is, I think that there's a few different angles of why you should care about open source. One is you're most likely already using open source software. So I think that the track that this was specifically listed under is Python. Python is an open source technology. So that's a really good example. There's a lot of other ones. If you've heard of GitLab, which is an alternative to GitHub, that's an open source project. So being able to contribute to those things that you already use and being able to feed that loop back of buying into what it is that you use can be really healthy for the community and the technology field at large. And what you can bring to it is literally anything. It doesn't need to be code contributions. It can be maintenance and triaging issues and even just voting on the TSC, the technical steering committee, to kind of put your voice into where you want the technology to go.
Yeah, and I would just add on that, as Jolene said, open source technology is not just publicly available to use, but its source code is publicly available. So even if you're not contributing to a specific technology, just dive into the source code and check out something you're interested in. And you can learn things just by looking at how other developers have coded certain logic, or going through their GitHub and looking at the different issues and the discussions there. You'll definitely learn a lot. And one more thing of why this can be beneficial to developers, especially for developers who are looking for a job. I think it's great when you can have open source contributions that are publicly available for others to see and share. I know a lot of times when you're looking for a new job, it can be tough because, like Jolene said, the code that you're writing for your current job is proprietary, right? So you can't really share that with potential recruiters and such. So contributing to open source gives you a way to have stuff to show that you've worked on.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next point that we went over was how to make the case to your employer, or if you're a manager, to your employees. Basically, how to kind of cultivate buy-in through your peers as to why they should care, why your company, for example, should invest in you spending time working on open source that the company uses, because that will then, in turn, make the product that makes your product good even better, making your product even better.
Yeah, and I would say it definitely, weigh the benefits and cons, right? So just make the decision based on the project at hand, and whether or not you think you'll benefit, or your company will benefit from making that software open source, and getting those external parties involved, getting the community involved and contributing, and just opening up more innovation that you may have otherwise had if your code was just kept behind closed doors.
It's also really great for knowledge transfer and open collaboration. So as Diana was just saying, that's a way to learn from other people in a very transparent fashion. You can follow what people are doing. You can even ask questions as they're doing it. It's a really beneficial thing to be a part of. And then I think this is the final point. Yeah, the kind of piggybacking off of that last point is that it fosters community building and networking. So not only does it pad your portfolio for job searching, for example, it also pads your network in terms of the people that you know and the experience that you've had with different demographics and different people with different skill sets. So going into our first kind of main point for today's webinar is how to find a project. So one of the first approaches and the most, I think the easiest one is going to be using a technology you already use. So as an example I used earlier, if you already use Python, that could be a good way to contribute, pad your resume, pad your portfolio, and get a better understanding of how the language even works that you're working with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that's a great way to look at it. And a lot of times you'll find out from using libraries that there's actually a bug or a specific feature that you would like in your use. So for example, in a Chord project, we use an open source library called Slate.js. It's a rich text editing library. So we have a contract editor in AP. We'll talk more about a Chord project at the end. But yeah, so while we were developing using this library, we found a bug in the library that was affecting our use. So because Slate is open source, it was really easy for us to go in and make a PR to fix that bug. And if the library we're using wasn't open source, that could be a much longer process where you have to put in a bug report and wait for someone to prioritize it and make a fix for it, things like that. Whereas we already saw the benefits of using an open source library ourselves for this contract editor, because we were able to expand on that library within the community.
Yeah, absolutely. So another way to kind of follow that thread is that if there aren't any specific things that jump out to you on what libraries you already use, maybe too many jump out to you and you don't know how to, you're not really sure how to narrow them down, but you could search by what language they actually use. So if you wanted to contribute to Python, and I don't actually know what's written in, but let's say it's written in C, a language that you might not be familiar with, well, that would kind of better scope yourself for what you wanted to contribute to. Like, I'm only familiar with JavaScript, or I do want to get more familiar with C. Whatever it is, that's one of the filters that you can use within GitHub, at least, to narrow down what kind of library that you want to contribute to. Another opportunity is Hacktoberfest, which is what we're speaking about. We'll get more into the details of it, but it's a way in which you can be exposed to a lot of open source technologies and libraries that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise be exposed to. So when there's a huge list of repositories that are participating in Hacktoberfest, you might be exposed to a new language that you might like better than Python. I don't know how likely that is, but as an example. Another way to be finding a project is to kind of find communities in an industry of interest. So, for example, if you're interested in legal tech, a core project might be something that will come up for you when you're searching through for legal tech open source technologies. Another one would be biotech. I don't know what an example would be, but that would kind of narrow you down of maybe it isn't a specific technology that you want to use or you already use, but maybe it's a field that you want to be contributing to and learn more about the technologies and the people involved. Do you have anything to add to that one, Diana?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way to discover new technologies and software. I think even if you don't end up contributing to one of those technologies that you find in the fields, you might find a community that you have something in common with, or a software that you want to use for your own personal use. If you're interested in music and you find some really cool music apps, then you'll benefit just that way as well.
Yeah, and another point that I wanted to mention in the search for an open source library is to compare and contrast comparable libraries. So many people might be familiar with Webpack. That's the best example that comes to my mind. Webpack is a library that's usually used on the front end for websites to pack up a whole bunch of stuff to deliver it to the browser through JavaScript. And there are other libraries, so Parcel, Rollup, and a couple other ones. And when you come across these, you might find these alternatives and find that some of the communities aren't as good for your case in particular as other ones. Maybe some are more inviting than other ones. So there's a lot of factors that you might want to look into of, it's what language is it written in? You might not be familiar with that language, so that might mark one off. But one of the things that I would really focus on personally is how well structured that technology's organization is, or the community is. How easy is it for you to kind of get onboarded? Is it really difficult? Are people not that welcoming? Is it kind of the community that you might expect from something like Stack Overflow, where people aren't particularly inviting? That might help you navigate what kind of library to kind of get more acclimated towards.
Yeah, I would say the number one thing to do before you start, looking to contribute to a project, if it's one that you just found, is definitely make sure it's currently active and actively being maintained. Because I know there's a lot of projects on GitHub that are stale, and you don't want to devote your resources to something that's not going to come to fruition. So yeah, I would say the first thing is check that it's active. And I do see that we have a question in the chat. Jolene, would now be a good time to go to some questions?
Yes.
Great. So I see Francesca has asked, she's a UX designer. She says, how do you see UX folks getting involved in the open source community? I think that's a great question. I think, especially since Jolene and I do a lot of work on the front end in open source, we see UX designers playing a big role in the open source community around front end specifically. I think one of the big things to do is when you're looking at a project, look at and we'll discuss this later, but look at the GitHub issues. And I know there's a lot of discussions around there that bring in, not just developers contributing code, but UX designers, graphic designers, and other people who aren't, specifically contributing code, but are contributing to those discussions, giving mock-ups, giving style tips and decisions. So I think that's a great way. Julian, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that basically ditto to what Dinah said of, anything front-end based is going to take some sort of design input, especially when it comes to accessibility. But even communities or technologies that aren't front-end focused, if you're really interested in something that is like Python, where it's not necessarily front-end, it's just a language, you can definitely contribute to what is the user experience of the contributor? What is the user experience of the developer approaching the documentation, approaching the community? That's something that personally I feel like a lot of open source communities could use a lot of work on, and that is the lower barrier to entry for developers. I think the impression that I get from other people, and especially that I had joining or getting involved with open source, was that it was very daunting and things weren't really organized, and it was really hard to figure out what to do and how to do it. And that's something that UX designers, I think, can absolutely get involved in. The next question, Christy, whoops. How did you find communities in an industry of interest? So, well, two-part answer for me is, one is a core project I found because my employer clause founded it. And so that's a part of my job description, is to contribute to a core project. But the way that I would have found it, because when I was coming into clause, I actually was coming into it because I had a vested interest in smart contracts, essentially. So relatively legal tech. And I think that these are times where you can utilize your already existing communities a lot outside of regular internet searching what are, legal tech, open source technologies. Women Who Code is a really good resource of reaching out to that network, because it's a gigantic network, and see if anyone else has experience with certain things, and maybe that can provide you with certain leads.
Yeah, and I would say just look at things that you use in your personal life that might be open source. For example, just this weekend, I play a lot of this card game called Magic the Gathering. And this weekend I discovered a website called Cube Cobra that's basically lets you create like a digital record of your collections and organize them online so that you can basically organize them into collections that you can play with. So I started using that website just as a user and found out that this site happens to be open source. So now I'm looking into that as something that I can contribute to, and it's something that I'm interested in.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, again, I said that there'd be built-in time, so just type those in. I don't know if you can, Dinah, I can't see the actual chat. I can only see the Q&A right now, because it's I'm sharing.
Yep, I do see the chat, and I don't see any questions in the chat. I think they're all coming through the Q&A.
Great. So moving on to how to contribute to an open source project. So now we're presupposing that you found one and you want to get involved and you're not really sure where to start. So I think one of the first approaches that you want to take is looking through a specific subset of their documentation. So most, if not all, open source projects are going to have some sort of developer and or contributing guidelines. And so those will usually be found in their main repository on their GitHub or whatever their hosted medium is. And those files will provide context for what are their specific guidelines to contributing. So some open source projects will want you to have specific format to how you open an issue or how you open a pull request. And others might not care as much, but that's going to be something that you're going to find out through those files. And they might also have added context of maybe they're going to suggest that the best starting point is going to be to join their Slack community or their Discord community and speak to them through there. It's all up to that specific open source community. And so that's probably the first step to contributing. Anything you would add to that, Diana?
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I think that goes back to what Jolene was saying about open source software, and the maintainers really need to consider the accessibility for contributors themselves. So if you find a project that you like and you don't see these sort of guidelines, definitely reach out to the maintainers and let them know that you're looking for these guidelines. And they should be aware that this is something that helps contributors add value to their software.
Yeah, so let's pause at that point because we have an anonymous question. I've worked as Jekyll developer for the past year. I have worked with converting from WordPress to Jekyll as a freelancer. Do you think that I can find a job with that skill set in advance? That I do not know, and I'm not entirely sure that's in the purview of what we're specifically talking about. I don't know that much about Jekyll specifically, and I don't know how viable that is for your resume.
Yeah, I would say if you're kind of looking for if people need that skill set in the context of open source, like we said, look at those languages, look for open source projects, talk with the communities and see if people are hiring for developers with that specific skill set.
Yeah, and the next question is Charlotte. As a maintainer of a brand new project, do you have some examples of repositories with guidelines that you think are clear and well done? Well, first and foremost, I think a core project is. And we'll get to kind of information on that later. I think couple other ones that come to mind that I think are generally highly regarded in terms of their documentation in open source, Hyperledger and Babel and React is also pretty good. And also is Gatsby even open source? I'm not sure.
It is.
Pretty sure that one.
It has the open source component.
Yeah, would you add to that?
No, I think that's a great list. I think at the end of this call, when we talk more about a core project, if there's time, we can get into a little more specifics of how we've organized our software so that it's easier for developers to contribute to and understand.
Yeah, and I just added also style components. That's another.
That's a great one, yeah.
So next point is contributing to a project, GitHub issues. So if you've looked at a GitHub repository, and if we have time later, we'll probably pull that up and show some of these points. But GitHub repositories have issues and they have pull requests. And pull requests are usually referring to an issue. So an issue is not necessarily a bad thing. It's like I'm opening an issue. It's basically a forum thread within the GitHub kind of architecture. So I want a new feature, or I have a question, or I'm opening a discussion. Those are all new issues. And if the open source community is doing hopefully a decent job, then those issues will be labeled and you can kind of filter to find what it is that you're looking for. Like you want to work on a bug, or you want to work on a feature, or you want to work on something that is for newcomers. It's an easy one to get a hold of. Those are all things that you'll be able to navigate. And also, I think that issues, my approach when I first started, and I, again, think that I get the impression from a lot of other people, is that it's intimidating to open a new issue because it feels like you're just wasting space or like you're wasting people's time. I treat issues as like completely throwaway. Open as many as you want. There's no limit to how many you can open. So just open one and ask a question. If it's already been asked, people will refer you to where it's been asked and answered, and it's resolved. I think that as an open source maintainer, I would say that I would rather have people opening issues that I think were already answered or that have already been solved than not opening them at all and just being quietly frustrated that they can't get their question answered.
Yeah, and I would say, before you open an issue, you can definitely check if an existing issue related to that already exists and kind of do your research on if that was solved or if there was discussion around it. Yeah, you can look at, the closed issues. There's ways to search and filter and things, or currently open issues, especially on very big projects that have a lot of contributors and a lot of people putting in issues. It can be a little overwhelming. So I think, yeah, as Jolene said, try your best to search if an issue exists. If you can't find it, put in the issue, and if it's an issue that they're not prioritizing or that they think they've already solved, the maintainers will let you know in the discussion. And then one more thing I would add to that is once you've found an issue that you want to work on, discuss with the maintainers, ask to be assigned to the issue, propose your solution inside of that GitHub's issue before you start working on the code itself, because sometimes the maintainers will want to give you some guidance or just their own thoughts on how they would like that issue solved. So a lot of times, especially if it's like a big feature or something that's going to be, not just like one line of code being changed, you'll definitely want to discuss that with the maintainers and then also the other contributors to the project and the community before you start working on it, so you don't end up creating this huge PR for this huge feature that they decide is not exactly what they wanted in that project. Because at the end of the day, is kind of the maintainers who are going to be approving those PRs and merging them.
Yeah, absolutely, and treat it as an open forum for transparent reasons, or for transparency and for everyone to be able to voice their opinion on what it is that you're doing. And vice versa, you can voice your opinion on something that someone else is doing. Another way to contribute, this also kind of ties in with how to even find a project, is that say you're working with a library like React, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, and there's a specific hook that you're really interested in, whether it is to learn more about it or to contribute to it. Well, at the top of your file, whenever you're using that, you import it from a library. So when you go into that library, you can drill down in the file structure and find out where that function or that hook is defined and see what it's actually doing behind the scenes whenever you use it. And that's a great way to kind of take something tangible that you're using on a daily basis or on a weekly basis and translating that into what you want to work on specifically and drilling down through that file structure and disregarding all of the other stuff that might seem confusing or complicated. You can get down to exactly what it is that you're working on.
Yeah, and I would add to this one of my favorite things about using open source software is the ability to do exactly this. You're using a certain function or component that you're importing, and maybe the documentation isn't that great, and you don't exactly know, like, oh, I'm using this function, but am I passing it the right arguments and things like that. So if you go through the documentation and you're still confused, just go into the source code and look at exactly what that code is doing, what that logic is doing, what it expects from the client that's using it, what it returns, things like that. It'll, help you learn, like how I said earlier, even if you're not contributing, just going through open source code is a great way to learn from other developers. And it'll make your code that's using that library, it'll make it, you know, you'll understand the library so much more than if you didn't look at that source code. So your code that's using it will be a lot cleaner and less error prone. I know that has happened a lot with the library that I mentioned that we use in a core project called Slate. Sometimes if the documentation is confusing or something's not working the way I expect it to work, I just go into the source code, you know, look at what's going on, how the developer coded something, and it really helps me as a developer using that software to be able to understand better what I'm using.
I'm going to pause there, and Elena in the Q&A has a question. How would you best gather your contributions in an open source community and showcase them to potential employers when searching for a job? I think that this goes with something we've spoken a little bit about of how the transparency and the breadcrumbs that you have in a well-structured open source community will really play in nicely here. So if you have submitted fixes or features into a code base through pull requests, then you can go to that repository and go under pull requests, and in the filter section, filter for ones that were created by you. And then you've created a custom link that showcases all the pull requests that you've put in. That's what I would personally do, is basically in my resume, I'd be talking about, you know, I contributed to React or whatever. And there, I would provide a link where I would link that to that search query within GitHub that showcases all of my pull requests. And then the employer can look at what it exactly was that you did. How did you document your code? What did other people think of it? How, you know, all those kinds of things. That's probably my main approach. Let's see. So yeah, again, contributing to a project goes back to the GitHub issues. I think that it's really helpful to ask for guidance or help through GitHub issues, or if the community uses Slack or Discord or any other medium, to get a sense of what it is that people are looking for. And maybe, again, like Diana said, maybe there's something that the maintainers know that they haven't had a chance to document yet, and you might not know. So it's good to voice your presence, voice that, like, you know, I'm here, I'm looking to contribute, even if you don't need help. It's great to, as a community member, to know that someone's working on something or someone's interested in something. So maybe I can provide context because I might know something about that. Yeah,
totally. And I would say the Slack and Discord channels are great for, as we mentioned earlier in this talk, networking with other developers. I think we already mentioned that open source communities are a great way to meet new developers and just learn from them. So I think a lot of times those discussions do happen in these Slack organizations, and questions that you have that maybe have already been answered or asked by other people in the community, you can search for those in Slack. A core project has a Slack as well, where we're very active with our community there. So it's great.
Yeah, and then another question before we move on is our Slack channel or somewhere where we can discuss our work for Hacktoberfest in Women Who Code? I would punt to you, Kamari, if you're around and can answer that. So I'm going to leave that one open for right now.
Yeah, I would just say, if you're interested, we're going to talk again at the end about a Accord project, but if you are interested in contributing to a Accord project specifically, there last year we did have a separate Slack channel specifically for Hacktoberfest and communicating with the new contributors to the project who found us through Hacktoberfest.
Yeah.
And we'll do that again this year.
So we're going to provide the PowerPoint online, but if you want to take a screenshot, now's the time to take a screenshot of a couple helpful resources, links that we would recommend around this whole open source and Hacktoberfest and so on. So one of them is from DigitalOcean. So that's a tutorial. DigitalOcean is, as I'm about to say in a second, the one who puts on Hacktoberfest. So that's their introduction to open source. And then dev.to is also a sponsor of Hacktoberfest, and they have a guide for, or someone posted a guide, it's not their guide specifically, but someone posted a guide that I thought was really great on contributing to open source. It's specifically about JavaScript, but it's applicable to any other language or library.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good resources online for contributing through GitHub. I think that's mostly where a lot of open source contributions happen. And if you haven't contributed to open source before, it can be a bit confusing on you know, how to open pull requests, how to fork repositories, how to rebase your repositories, things like that. So those types of questions are definitely answered. I know a bit in that first link, but also if you just search online, there's a lot of good articles out there on that. And on GitHub's documentation as well. They have good documentation.
Yeah. So Hacktoberfest, as I alluded to, it's presented by DigitalOcean and Dev, and then I think this year is the first year that Intel is involved as well. So Hacktoberfest, in case anyone is unaware, it's a month-long kind of celebration of open source. So during October, obviously, and the way that the event kind of works is that DigitalOcean, they ask that you register as a participant, as a contributor on their website. And if you do, and you submit 4 pull requests within October to any open source repository, any public repository, and they're merged within October, then you get a t-shirt and maybe stickers. You'll have to check their site, I can't remember. But it's definitely a shirt, and it will have this design on it, or something like this. And it's a great way, as we alluded to way earlier, is that to get familiar and introduced to new open source repositories. I think a lot of people I've seen spin up new public repos specifically designed to onboard new junior developers. So they're not actual libraries that get used out in the real world, like React, for example, but they're repositories that are specifically designed to get you to contribute and become familiar with contributing to open source. So you can find those by searching or through GitHub, filtering for Hacktoberfest labeled projects.
Yeah, and I would say this is especially a great way for new developers or developers who are new to contributing to open source specifically, because the organizations that like explicitly participate in Hacktoberfest and use that label, they are usually organizations that want new contributors and are open to new developers contributing and, you know, have the capacity to help those new developers. I mean, maybe not all of them are, you know, have as much capacity for that, but usually if people are participating in Hacktoberfest, it's because they want to help the community and help new developers. That's one of the reasons why we like to contribute.
Yeah. Again, pausing for a reminder that if you have any questions, just put them in Q&A and we'll answer them as we keep going. So the next point is a little bit more about a core project. So this is a Linux Foundation project around smart legal contracts. And we have a working group call, so a technology working group call every week on Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern. And this coming Wednesday, we're planning on doing a follow-up, basically a follow-up to this webinar that will kind of help introduce anybody who's interested in a core project or interested in contributing to an open source project and doesn't necessarily know where to begin, introducing them to a core project. So it'll be kind of a high-level overview of how the technology is structured and the repositories are structured in the core project. Again, here's the Slack sign up if you want to join us in Slack. I would take a screenshot for later kind of copying this down. And then the main website can be found there. So anything that you would add to that, Dana?
Yeah, I would say definitely join that working group call if you're interested, even just to learn more about, like I said, the specifics of putting those pull requests, putting in issues, things like that. We'll definitely do a deep dive into how we organize our issues, how we organize our pull requests. Specifically, we do like a DCO sign off for each pull request, for each commit into our repos that shows that you're the owner of that code, you wrote it. So things like that can be a little tricky for new developers across all, open source software. Each project has its own little requirements that they have, or their own way of doing things. But I think in this working group call, you'll learn a lot more about how to contribute to a Cord project specifically. But it also might be helpful just for contributing to really any project on GitHub. You'll learn a lot during that.
Cool, and that's all for the presentation, the slides. If we're waiting for more questions, I'll basically start going off into GitHub and showcasing some of the things that we've been talking about within AP. So issues, PRs, and the contributing and developer guidelines. So I'm going to start doing that just a little bit and see if anyone has any questions, and then we'll kind of tie this off. So.
Great, and I'll just mention, I'm seeing in the chat now that the Women Who Code fellow clarified that they will be making a dedicated Slack channel in the front end organization for Hacktoberfest. So to answer someone's question earlier, that's in the chat.
Cool. Hopefully this is maximized or zoomed in enough for everyone. But so I'm in the core project repository, or the core project's tech docs repository, so technical documentation. And this is where you find the contributing and developer guides. And that information will kind of contain stuff about the code of conduct, what issues, how to file issues and bugs or feature requests, and then like guidelines around submitting issues or pull requests. And in the developer docs, it'll also give you information about kind of how to generally go about setting up a local development environment for any of the core project technologies. And then, so those are the guides. And then in issues, so this is a good spot to kind of showcase that if I want to see, to the question that was earlier, if I want to see all the pull requests, all the code that I've submitted to this, then I can filter by author and select myself and do all the closed ones, because anything that I've had merged is now closed. And there I can see all the things that I've submitted. And as an employer, that gives me a good showcase of what's one that might actually show more stuff. So.
And I'll quickly interject that thank you, Shayna, for putting the sign up link for the Accord Project Slack in the chat. So if you guys didn't get a screenshot of that link or don't want to type it out, you can just click it in that chat. And she also put a link to the Women Who Code front end Slack.
So yeah, as an employer, I can go, if I'm given this link of all the contributions that someone's made to this repository, then I can go in and see like what it is they did, all the information, what other people said. I can see all the files that were changed, all the actual code that was written. Yeah, I think that that's a really good way to showcase your work if it's an open source. There might be a better way. I'm not entirely sure of what that would be. And then same thing with the issues of where you can use these labels of, there's a lot of issues, 4 pages of issues, and I don't really know how to filter based on maybe difficulty level. So in a core project, we have difficulty levels, and I'm just getting started to a core project, so I would want to do starter difficulty, and then now I'm only looking at issues that are a little bit more introductory than other issues. So these filtering functionality that you have in GitHub is going to be really useful in that sense. Yeah, so that's kind of all I really have there. Do we have any final questions? And I can't see chat.
No, I don't see any questions at the moment.
Nothing's in the chat right now. This is just Kamari jumping in again. Thank you again, Shauna, for posting the links that you did. But yes, if you have any other questions, please ask them now.
Yeah, if not, then we'll close up in maybe a minute. Any other things that you wanted to add in, Diana?
No, I would just say thank you so much to Women Who Code for hosting this webinar and inviting us to share this information with all of you. And I hope it was helpful to people who are interested in contributing to open source, whether you've contributed before or you're completely new to it. I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, absolutely. I would reiterate everything, and then also reiterate that anyone who's interested, please feel free to join the tech working group call for a core project. Again, that's this coming Wednesday, which is the 30th, September 30th at 4 p.m. Eastern time zone. And it's about an hour long. You can jump in and jump out any time that you want. So really hoping to see more people, anybody from this call to join that. That'd be great. Yeah. All right. I think we're going to close it there, Kamari.
Sounds great. And I just want to reiterate, a lot of people in the chat are saying thank you, and thank you to you both for presenting this information. It was very useful, and I'm really excited that you got to spend some time doing that today. So until next time.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.